Hey there, this is Dan. You're watching the Salty Sea, and here is a big old video about the entire Warcry meta for the spring of 2023. I know that spring is almost over. I'm talking about everything that happened in spring, and we can use this to look ahead to the summer too. I've got stats for faction win rates. I've got tournament list rundowns. I've even got a tier list and a grid for you. So let's take a look. First of all, here are the stats for Warcry tournaments for faction win rates since the FAQ. One of the funny things that came out of Warhammer Fest is, one, I love the energy. The Warhammer folks were shocked and almost, it sounded by people who were there saying they were almost frustrated by how many more questions there were for Warcry than anything else, which is awesome to hear. One thing that they noted was that they don't really have a lot of data for tournaments for Warcry, and part of that is that they're bad at collecting the data. I've done a little bit of work here to, track down tournament organizers. I've done this through putting out videos talking about these sorts of stats and wanting to see these sorts of results. And so I've talked with a lot of tournament organizers who put their tournaments up not on BCP, just ran them themselves. Gotten quite a bit of data that I don't think that GW really has access to at the moment. So I've done enough to get, since the FAQ, decent play rates for about half of the game's factions, which is something I'm pretty happy about. We're still in the early days. I'd love, to see how this data develops over the next 3 months when we can, double this amount of games played. Because we're still on the area where, take for example, Rotmire Creed, right? They have 20 games played, 5 players bringing them to events. That's enough where if it was 20 random games, the odds of getting a false positive on 20 random games in a tournament setting is pretty low, right? You'd say that that's good. But because it's 5 player entries, if it's the same player for 4 of those entries, it's not. In the case of Rotmire Creed, it's 5 different people. But if it were the same player in the case of 4 of those entries, then that would be skewing the data quite a bit. And so things like a single player who goes to a lot of tournaments with the same faction every time can skew the data. Things like 2 or 3 players talking online about a single faction and then all going to an event to kind of prove something about that faction, that can skew the data quite a bit. Things like that. So vibes can throw the data off when we're looking at samples this low, but for the most part, I'm really happy about it. And there's a quote, I can't remember what professional Magic player said this, but they basically said that professional Magic is the art of generalizing using sample sizes that are too small to do so scientifically, because we have the data we have, and it's up to us to figure out what conclusions we can make and what conclusions we can't make from that. And so with that in mind, let's look at the top factions. I'm cutting this off at 55%. You can see, Ogre Maw Tribes, Iron Golems, Iron Jaws are all right around in that area. I'm not going to sort of talk about them as concerning yet, although I think that Maw Tribes win rate could be going up and up. But the top 4 have one thing in common, and that is cheap move 3 chaff. Interesting things about that. So list building rules make it so that the best elite fighters in the game, they're almost all heroes, not all of them. I mean, Storm Fiends, Rat Ogres, those are not heroes. There's a couple other elite fighters that are not heroes, Korgoraths. But most of the best elite fighters are heroes, and so they can go into any faction, right? So they just get mixed and matched. So the thing that actually makes a powerful faction is having the best chaff, because that's the thing that no one else can borrow. So that's kind of the thing that makes a good faction, is whether you have the best chaff in the game. And right now the best chaff is move 3. We are seeing this over and over and over, is that cheap move 3 fighters, whether they're move 3 and really high damage fighters like Graveguard, or they're move 3 and really resilient fighters like a lot of the dwarves that are out there. I'm calling this the year of the dwarf. All the dwarves are good right now. Even though Fire Slayers aren't on this list, it's only because nobody plays them. They are quite good. Those factions are rising to the top. The one fun one is Seraphon. Now, if you look at the chi-squared here, the statistics aren't that impressed with these Seraphon numbers in terms of saying that these are statistically definitely different than 50%. Things like Soulblight Gravelords and Demons of Nurgle I can basically guarantee you that those are not 50% true win rate factions. Seraphon, we're less convinced, but it's gotten pretty consistent. They were around that 53-54% win rate before the FAQ. They've only gone up. They've got some nice stuff going on with them that I'll get to later, because we've got some good Seraphon lists out there that we can get into in the list review section. But first, let's go for the really high stuff, because you've probably been looking at that table and being like, why won't he talk about it? Why won't he talk about it? Because yes, there is an 80% win rate for Nurgle demons. Now, Chimeras count for 12 of those wins. I went 4-0 with a Chimera Nurgle list. Alan is a player in the UK who has gone 8-0 in UK tournaments with Chimeras in Nurgle demons. That has been just really running roughshod over every tournament that it's in. I'll talk more about that list later, but for now, non-Chimera Nurgle, the win rate is 9-4-2, 9 wins, 4 losses, 2 draws. So that's not enough to be sort of statistically significant, but it's still pretty good, and I think it's in line with what I would expect. I would say that Nurgle as a faction is about in line with Soulblight and Kharadron Overlords and a lot of the other Move 3 factions. And so they're still really solid, except that they can play this completely broken profile in the Chimera. Looking at Soulblight, did the nerf stop them? No, not at all. I do think it made them a lot worse in the core book missions, the first missions that came out for matched play, where there's a lot of brawling, there's a lot of center punch-ups, and now they don't have their hilarious offensive combo where they just resurrect an old dead Graveguard just right into your face once you're done with activations, and then it just gets 2 free attacks in. Being able to use resurrections offensively is one of the things that got nerfed in the FAQ. But the thing that's helped Soulblight weather that nerf, one, I think they would have been okay still without it. But two, there's been kind of a seismic shift, especially in who's running tournaments, in that the UK has just been running more and more and more tournaments, and almost entirely with the Rumble Pack, which is an incredibly skewed tournament pack full of incredible missions. Again, 5 of the 6 missions in the Rumble Pack as missions I think are absolutely excellent, but as a group I don't think they're good. I don't think it's good at all. And one of the things it does is it incentivizes you to exploit it in a very specific way that really goes with Soulblight's strengths. And so Soulblight has kind of, yes, they were nerfed, but they've been the beneficiaries of some kind of odd mission pack choices by TOs. And so they've been winning a whole lot. KO is also very, very good and sees a Sigmar. This is all dispossessed, so hammerers and all of the Tempest side dwarves that are winning so much. Again, just that move 3 chaff along with the ability to bring in any kind of heavy hitter they need is really powerful. Looking at the bottom, I just wanted to think about whether we have a lot of concerns here, and I think we do. So what do all these lists have in common, right? So there's sort of 2 different categories here. There's the ones where it's just hard to write a good list. Nighthaunt, Untamed Beast, and Tzeentch. It's really hard to write a list that is going to win a tournament with those factions. Nighthaunt, I put them here even though they don't have 20 games played yet, because they were just such big losers of the FAQ. You'll see this in a minute, but they were really hurt, and they are really that is a rough win rate. It's also, for the rest of these factions, just really easy to write a bad list. Like Khorne, Sylvaneth, FEC, Gloomspite, Dark Oath, all of those you could write a pretty solid list. But it's also just all of those, and plus Tzeentch as well with Carrick Acolytes and Skyfires, they all have at least a few just like utterly horrible, unplayably bad fighters that look really cool and people want to play them. And so people tend to just show up with really terrible lists for those factions. Not terrible as in like you're a terrible person for running it, but just lists that can't win. And that's okay, because they're maximizing for having some of the coolest sculpts in the game and just having a ton of fun, and that's great for them, but they're not going to win. And so that's what's bringing the stats down of those factions, right? I mean, The new Sylvaneth archers with the beautiful fairy wings, I think, are some of the best sculpts in all of miniature gaming, and they are really, really impossible to win with in Warcry. These are not the worst factions in the game, though, right? So if you were to try to use these stats to sort of boost the points of some stuff and drop the points of some other stuff, I wouldn't necessarily do that on the bottom end, because the worst factions are actually the ones that aren't getting played enough to have results. For example, Khorne Bloodbound, right? 33% win rate. That looks pretty bad. Khorne Bloodbound is so much better than Khorne Demons. I mean, it's not even close, right? But no one's playing Khorne Demons because no one wants to bring Khorne Demons to an event because they're that bad. Same with Daughters of Cain. Daughters of Cain are just really, really struggling. It's actually kind of wild because they were one of the more popular factions in the game pre-FAQ in the early days of 2.0, because they were kind of pretty good towards the end of 1.0. Once pet meta kind of dissolved, they kind of had a lot of really nice tools. But people have just given up on their Daughters of Cain warbands because you just can't bring them to an event. You can't play them in any situation other than narrative play because they're just so non-functional on the table. And so those are the factions that are really not getting played, as opposed to some of these ones that have really low win rates. They are struggling competitively. They do need some buffs here and there, but those are not the worst factions in the game at all. But if we are going to kind of dig into some of them, Gloomspite, a lot of people talk about Gloomspite Gitz as if they're top tier. They are one of the more popular factions in the game. It's just notable that it's just so easy to stumble with them. They have a lot of bad fighters on the roster, as well as the good fighters. And even the good stuff is just very difficult, takes a lot of thought. I'll show a really successful Gloomspite Gitz list later in the lists section, and you'll kind of see what I mean as far as how difficult it is to deploy Gloomspite on the table. The same is true for Flesh Eater Courts, where things revolving around Chosen of the King have legitimately a decent amount of success in 2.0, but there's so many other things that it's tempting to play with, and those things are not winning. Nighthaunt, though, they just got destroyed by the FAQ. A friend of mine who runs Nighthaunt basically runs them as a home for the exiled dead, because they're finding that Nighthaunt is at their best when there's only a couple Nighthaunt fighters in there, which is kind of tough. Tzeentch, I recently took them to a tournament. They are presenting as the worst faction in the game with enough games to actually say anything statistically. I don't think they're actually the worst faction in the game. As I said before, all the factions that aren't being played, most of those factions are worse than Tzeentch. But they have a lot of reasons that they're struggling. They struggle at top tier play, and they have a lot of traps for bottom tier play. But you can make respectable lists with them. Take this with a grain of salt. I took them to a tournament. I went 1-1-1, and that was my first Warcry tournament ever where I didn't end with a winning record. So maybe that does mean that they're bad, but I don't think that that's true. I think that they're a very average faction that's just really easy to build horribly, and that's why they're presenting so low here. But I mentioned it with Nighthaunt, and I think it's worth digging into. What are some of the biggest shifts pre and post the FAQ? Because that's really the big difference between the winter meta and the spring meta, is how did this FAQ, that totally boosted all the points on monsters, that took out a ton of the triples on heroes that were creating soup lists, did that make a big difference to any factions? One, I started when I was doing the big compilation of data. I started off doing a bunch of tags for, say, elite warbands, swarm warbands, soup lists. And soup lists were tracking around 65% win rate, which is like Soulblight Gravelords. So the FAQ didn't do anything to soup as a concept. Now, the issue was I found that elite and swarm were also tracking above 50% win rate. All of those tags for how a list is built, they basically just become weak proxies for, did this person put in a lot of time tuning their list? You don't trip, fall, and end up with a 7 fighter list or a 10 plus fighter list. You only do that, unless it's Stormcast, you only do that because you put a lot of thought into your list. And so that's why basically every tag I tracked was above 55%. Elite was the least above it, but even elite lists with 7 or fewer fighters, were still tracking around 55-56% win rate. So it's powerful to tune lists. It's powerful to put thought into your lists. That's all that really told me. So they nerfed a lot of soup concepts, but soup is still doing really well, and Nighthaunt is not doing well. They were okay before, 44% win rate. Going to 19% is because the Resurrection nerf was done to hurt Soulblight Gravelords, to stop them from having these offensive combos. But the problem is Nighthaunt is a group of fast anvils whose strategy is to get in your face, block you from moving, win the objective game because you can't really get onto the objectives because you're fighting in your deployment zones. And then once you kill the thing that you fought, they resurrect it again and you have to kill it again. And Nighthaunt can play this really sort of finesse defense game, right? It's not even necessarily a control game so much as a board control game and a finesse defense. And really cool in that it's really unique. I know in AOS, a lot of people hate alpha blocking lists, but it's so much harder to put together in Warcry that I don't think it's NPE. I played a really tight game against a Nighthaunt player who was using that strategy, and it was actually really exciting and really fun. The problem is, now that they basically lose all the activations on the thing they resurrect, that's, their strategy was resurrecting 170, 240 point fighters. Soulblight was resurrecting 65 point fighters and being broken with that. Nighthaunt, you're now having a quarter of your list in any given round that you're not able to use, whereas Soulblight is now looking at 6%, 7% of their list in any given round that they're not able to use anymore. Those are not the same thing, right? So Nighthaunt was just obliterated by this resurrection nerf in a way that Soulblight Gravelords was just kind of barely tripped up, which is really a shame. And I think it shows that you can't just go make a ton of changes without then thinking about the second step from those changes. I will eventually do a video about, if I were to do a balance pass, what it would look like, but Nighthaunt will definitely be a part of it. Cities of Sigmar, you see a really huge shift the opposite direction, where that's actually a totally different thing. It's actually people starting to realize what this edition is about, what is being incentivized in this edition. You saw a lot of folks playing random elves in the early parts of Warcry 2.0, and it just not really working. Now, people have realized how good dwarves are, and they're trying all sorts of dwarves. And so a lot of folks have been taking Dispossessed, Tempest's Eye to tournaments and dominating, doing really, really well. And so that's where the win rate goes from 29% to 63%. And that's pretty exciting if you like your sort of Tolkien-based dwarves. I actually kind of like it. I wish... we're getting all these sort of hints about new Cities of Sigmar stuff. I haven't heard a single rumor about like new Tolkien-themed dwarves. It's all sort of new historical-themed dwarves, but it's like instead of being pure, or not dwarves, humans, it's like they take their historical human faction and they give them a sort of little bit of Imperium skulls are cool flavor, which I can't stand. I think the new Cities of Sigmar stuff is terrible. But that's me. A lot of other people like it. I've learned that you shouldn't crap on factions in your videos unless you are ready for people to be mad. So if you if you can have a sense of humor about me not liking a faction that you love, hit me with a like and a subscribe because some people won't. Some smaller interesting shifts that I think are kind of similar here. That I didn't put here, but like Ogors are up 12% as people kind of transition from lead belchers to big melee titans. Thunderstrike and Gloomspite Gitz are also both down as players are kind of taking lists that succeeded in core book events and trying to play them in the Rumble Pack, and those are kind of too different for a list to just go from one to the other. They're also both hurt by the drop in monsters. Gloomspite was pretty good at getting around monsters by netting them, and then Thunderstrike was extremely good at beating monsters. Annihilators are just like existential threats to monsters. And so the big thing that Thunderstrike was preying on isn't in the meta anymore, and so their win rate is just going down. Skaven and KO are kind of going up as players figure out the puzzle. Those are factions with some power in there, but they're just hard to play. And then, this is where I talked about vibes. Khorne, Flesh Eater Courts, and Beasts of Chaos have kind of gone down in win rate as top players who played those factions in a lot of tournaments just stopped playing them or stopped going to tournaments. And that just happens cyclically over time always. That'll keep happening to random factions, and that's just part of having kind of low numbers here. As we kind of keep playing the game and keep maybe stacking stats on other stats of different various periods of the game, you'll see that kind of stuff even out. But one thing, once you look at these changes, the FAQ really didn't affect that many factions. And so I felt a lot more comfortable combining them. And so this is combined stats of everything in 2.0. This is every faction that we've got at least 30 games for. So that's actually a much more, reliable amount of data to look at. And the first thing that jumped out to me is that Soulblight is by far the most popular faction. And if you thought that I didn't like Cities of Sigmar because they have too many Imperium, skulls are cool stuff on them, just wait till you hear my ideas on the faction that is actually made of skulls, Soulblight Gravelords. I don't get it. I don't get what people love about them, but I know that a lot of people do love them. They're the most popular faction in the game for a reason. Part of that reason is the win rate, but there are other factions with high win rates, and those aren't as popular. Do not go to a tournament without planning to play against Soulblight Gravelords. One thing I did notice is that the United States does not play nearly as much SBG. It's mostly Europe that plays them a ton, and continental Europe at that. So if you go to a tournament in, say, Spain or Poland, you should be prepared for 40 to 50% of the tournament to be Soulblight Gravelords. It is just that popular in those areas. I mean, think of all the tournaments that are in the US and how at most you'll see like 1 or 2 SBG players in them. And then think about the fact that they are 8% of the meta, right? So they are really, really popular in some parts of the world. You will see like half SBG at some tournaments. So definitely be prepared to play against them. Otherwise, there's a lot to look at here. I'm really just vamping so that you can take a look at these stats and kind of digest them in various ways. There's some really cool sort of surprises kind of up here, like Rotmire Creed, still doing pretty well post-fac, did great last fall. So the fact that that's kind of consistent, solid performance. This is absolutely, if you love bespoke warbands, that's a great choice that I think that you should try. This is also what I said about Seraphon, right? Even at almost 80 games, they're still just solidly, consistently good, which is cool because mechanically, sort of in their stat profiles, they don't do a lot of the things that a lot of maybe more math hammer oriented players would expect out of a really solid faction, and they're still doing great. And then you'll also see, most of these factions are in the fat middle. If you look at, 45 being at Slaanesh Sybarites to 55 being at Beasts of Chaos. But we do have more outliers than you would hope for a game, like say if AOS or 40K had this many outliers. I mean, 40K often does have this many outliers, but you would hope that GW would look at that and say, okay, we need to do some balance adjustments. And I think that that's where we're at. Most Warcry tournaments, because they have a pretty chill atmosphere, are going to be really fun. But there are a bigger difference, I think, between the top factions and the lowest factions than you would like to have in a collectible strategy game. One thing that's cool, though, is that there's a lot of factions that are just not loved enough that you can play and do really well with. And if you are a Warhammer hipster, and a lot of Warcry players are, because we are, playing the least popular GW game that can still work as like a wide, massive collectible strategy game. And so these are the factions. These are the factions that nobody plays. That if you go to a few tournaments, if you get one of these factions and paint it up really nice and start going to a lot of tournaments playing the same faction each time, you can really make a name for yourself as like the Fire Slayers guy, or the Cypher Lords girl, and you can do some really impressive stuff and surprise a lot of people. So I hope that some people take a look at this list and maybe get inspired for maybe some factions that aren't getting enough love to try them out on the table. Some of these factions are really good too, like Horns of Hashut is really, really good. Fire Slayers are really, really good. And some of them are really untested, right? Like the Claws of Karanak have a lot of rules that are just kind of weird that I think a lot of people haven't figured out if they're good or not yet. And maybe that's stopped people from bringing them to the table. But I'm really excited to see what does and eventually happen once we see more of them. So this is my version of a tier list right now, going into the summer metagame. These first 5 factions in meta defining, I think, are the strongest factions in the game. And they're just very, very scary, and they all show up enough that you gotta be, worried about them. Other than Horns of Hashut, these 4 show up enough, and then Horns of Hashut are just amazing, but nobody plays them. But then Gloomspite Gitz and Seraphon are also very good, not as good as those ones, but still very good and very, very popular. And so I still call them meta-defining because they're good enough to beat you, and you are going to see them everywhere. The chances of playing a tournament and not playing against either GSG or Seraphon are pretty low, I think. So be prepared for those, and I would really say that top column is really where the meta's at right now. But this second group has a lot of pretty powerful factions. They're all a threat to win a tournament. These are factions where if I see one of them winning a tournament, I go, yep, that makes sense. That is a list that wins tournaments. Some of them, like Ogors, Fire Slayers, Oziark Bone Reapers, are arguably maybe strong enough to be in that next tier up, but aren't really played enough quite yet to really see there. And then some of them, like Thunderstrike is played a lot, but powerful Thunderstrike lists are much more rare. You see a lot of more casual Thunderstrike lists playing maybe a few different heroes that are really fun and sweet, stuff like that. A lot of these can be kind of built as sort of a painter's dream warband, and so those are often not as powerful. But you could do an entire video on just like powerful configurations of any of these factions and have enough for me to go on for an hour. The next group, these are all really good in casual play. You can make really functional warbands with them, but they haven't really crushed it in tournaments yet. That doesn't mean they couldn't. Like, for example, I think Spire Tyrants, I just made a video about this. I think Spire Tyrants are one of the strongest factions in the game. They're down here because literally no one will ever make that list. That list is impossible to create. So it just takes too much work. No one will ever bring it to a tournament. So, this is a really good casual playlist. But Spire Tyrants are good, and I think if you wanted to be a crazy person, you could be the person who makes me put them up into this category. But the rest of these, they all just have good options, and most of them have win rates in the stats that are pretty respectable. The ones that don't, it's because, say, like Khorne, Bloodbound, they've got some really good lists in there, but they've also got some really bad ones. Don't worry about that, right? For casual play, that doesn't matter. And then the ones in the bottom are ones that are just, they're tough to use. Some of them, like, for example, Darko Savagers, if you just don't play any of the cool stuff and you and you like really min-max them, you can definitely do well in an event with them. Same is true with some of these Stormcast lists. Some people have done well with Vanguard. I think the same is somewhat true with Tzeentch Arcanites, but it's just tough. It's really, really tough. You have to put a lot of work into tuning them. And that work, if your goal is to win a tournament, all of that work will just have a lot less reward than tuning one of these always a threat factions. So you'd really just be doing it to prove a point, which is cool. I mean, there's a lot of spikes who they don't really play in a spiky way to win a tournament. They want to take a weak faction and prove a point about how it can be done a lot better. And these are the ideal ones for you. Some of these, though, it's like they just have a or a very low ceiling on what they can do, and that can be a little bit tougher. So let's get into some actual lists. And the talk of the town is anytime you put a Chimera into Nurgle Demons, what it actually looks like is a Sloppity Bilepiper, a Chimera, 5 Plague Bearers, and either a Nurglings or 2 Plague Bearers. There's kind of... well, first of all, let's just say the list has been 12-0 so far. I don't think that's truly how dominant it is. There are definitely, things in destruction that can definitely have a plan against it. There are Stormcast lists that don't really have a lot of fear of it in a lot of situations, can build themselves a lot of positive matchups against it. There are ways to beat this list. I was able to go 4-0 with this at Adepticon. Alan B has gone 8-0 with it in the UK on Rumble Pack missions. I think that the types of swarm lists that tend to make up the winning meta of the Rumble Pack are actually kind of uniquely weak against this plan, and so that might be why he's crushing everybody. He's also very comfortable with this warband. He had been playing it and playing various flavors of Nurgle Demons in events before this current post FAQ world, so he has a lot of practice with it, which is also probably part of why he's 8-0 with it lately. I think if more people were to play it more of the time, it would probably normalize to 75-80% win rate, which is still kind of unacceptably high. But this is the boogeyman right now. Luckily, not a ton of people are playing it. It works in kind of a 3-part harmony. First is the Chimera, which is the biggest, baddest, scariest profile in the game. It's very difficult to play against if you haven't seen one before, which is also, I think, partly why Alan and I have had so much success against it. It can kind of rattle a lot of people when they see sort of the capabilities on hand. And even if you are playing against it kind of with a clear mind, the decision to either commit to killing it versus choosing to avoid it is really, really difficult. And you have to choose the correct answer when you make that decision. And you kind of have to you have to basically decide by the end of round 1. And that can be pretty tough. That's just how it is. The way you want to kind of build around a Chimera, and you could do this in a couple other factions as well, probably. The first is you're going to want to pair with cheap activations, and what's so nice about doing it with Nurgle is that these are the cheapest fighters and some of the hardest to kill point for point in all of Chaos. These let you kind of time using the Chimera how you want, right? If you want to force the enemy to commit to some things before you move the Chimera in, maybe come in, hunt something that's already activated, you can do that by kind of moving Plague Bearers around first. Or if you want to just act right away with the Chimera, that's fine. You can obviously always do that, no matter what your activations are. And so you have this flexibility to choose to go first or wait, or choose to go early or just wait out the round. And then they also, because they're so hard to kill, they tend to just get reduced by your opponent at a much slower rate than your Chimera reduces their fighters. And they hold the ground, they score points, while the Chimera is running around killing everything. Finally, I think you want to top it off with some speed. Sloppity Bilepiper is incredibly important at scoring points in round 1 in the Rumble Pack. That's why I sort of played a Sloppity in my list, was to kind of get that going. The other thing, I like having the Nurglings to kind of do the same thing in the other deployment group for a little bit cheaper. Nurglings having that 5-inch move can get them places that your Plague Bearers just can't with 3 inches, which is why I really like having one Nurgling there too. Also having that 6 attack, 6 attacks, 3/1/3 profile is really nice against some of the high armor foes that can be a little bit annoying for the Chimera itself. So the Nurglings can actually be kind of a little annoying little speed bump to some of the factions that would otherwise be really good against you. So that can be really nice. Now let's get on to Soulblight Gravelords. I really like Mike's 4-0 list from Warhammer Fest. You went with a Vargoyle, an Abhorrent Archregent. That is a Flesh Eater Quartz fighter that has that nice movement buff from FEC. It also has a attack buff, I believe. And then a Direwolf. Direwolves are nice. They're terrible at fighting, so you don't want a bunch of them. I would never play a Direwolf if I wasn't going into a Rumble Pack tournament, but in the Rumble Pack, Direwolves are kind of nice because they can count. Some of the objectives are spaced close enough that Direwolves can count on 2 at once. Finally, after that stuff, we have 9, I believe, yes, 9 cheap move 3 chaff units, some of the most efficient fighters in the game. You have offensive cheap chaff units in your Graveguard. You have defensive ones in your skeletons and your zombies. Just a really incredible sort of mix of different weapons here. What I like about Mike's list building decision here is that Mike prioritized speed a little bit. The Vargoyle being the fastest leader that you can get in Soulblight Gravelords, and the Direwolf being a little quick friend, and the Archregent having a little speed buff. Those, I think, are all really helpful for Soulblight Gravelords, but it's not like they're the most necessary. Now, I'm about to say something that maybe could be misconstrued. So I really like Mike's list. It's obvious that Mike piloted it pretty well to go 4-0. But it's worth noting that all 5 Soulblight Gravelords players at Warhammer Fest won at least 3 games, right? The worst performance was 3-1. 4 of them went 3-1. And this was with all sorts of versions. We had slow, stompy versions. You had kind of mid-range. This is nothing against this player. Well done to this player. But you have kind of mid-rangey, almost Dirtlefest versions that are a lot of the random vampires, with maybe half the list was kind of Underworld's vamps, with then some chaff filling out the rest of the list. You have a lot of different versions that were all dominating in Warhammer Fest. That's partly because, so you have a lot of different leaders that are pretty reasonable. You can do the Vargoyle, you can do the Vamp Lord, King Velmorn, Prince Duval, a Necromancer. You could do a White King. That's a little awkward because King Velmorn is just a slightly better White King for the exact same points, but it's still something you can do if you don't have access to King Velmorn. All of those are options to you, and all of them are defensible. And Soulblight Gravelords is so strong right now that people aren't getting punished for choosing the less optimal one for their tournament loadout, right? They're still doing really well just because the faction is so ridiculously good. This isn't, again, I don't want to be disparaging any individual person. Certainly Mike, whose list I put up on the screen, I think is a brilliant execution of the game plan here. But I do think that novice players can still dominate with Soulblight Gravelords because just how overpoweringly efficient they are. You also have some cool, now I'm calling it cool, before I was kind of disparaging it because it's like so powerful anything can work, but it is kind of cool how many options you have. That's part of what defines Soulblight Gravelords, is all of our stuff is better than all your stuff, not just some of it. So you can do, for allies, right, you can do an Archregent like Mike did. You can do an Askergen Exemplar, which I think is pretty powerful. It's the option out of the new Vampire Warcry Bespoke team. Or you can do any Nighthaunt leader. I know their resurrection was nerfed, but it can still be useful to resurrect your own leader sometimes. Lots of options. This is probably the defining army in the game right now, just in that it's so popular, at least in Europe. Obviously, in the US, you don't really come across SBG much. You do occasionally, and those players have done okay, but haven't won any American tournaments yet. But yeah, if you play in Europe, you should expect from a quarter to 40% of your tournament to be Soulblight Gravelords, and the best one is probably going to win that tournament. Now let's talk about Kharadron Overlords. I've got a few videos where I've called KO what I think is the best faction in the game. I kind of still stand by that. I mean, I know that Nurgle has been so completely dominant, but that's mostly the Chimera, in my opinion. Without the Chimera, I think Nurgle would be kind of on par with Soulblight Gravelords and KO. Now, I do have to admit, the win rates aren't quite there where Soulblight is. And I think it's because KO is actually pretty complicated to make work. And players are starting to figure out the puzzle. And I think there's really two ways you want to play Kharadron Overlords. And so here's the first one. And I'm calling this kind of the traditional list. You could also call it the more like, it's a pure list, but it's like the pure fight for profit version. So you have 1 to 2 flyers, at least 2 leaders. Usually one of your leaders will be a flyer and one will not. Or you might have 3. And then you need to have at least 2 Thunderers. Then you're just going to fill in the rest with Arcanauts. You're not going to have as many Arcanauts in this version just because of how much other stuff you have to fit to combo. I would call that the one weakness of this version, but the combo is so strong that I think it makes up for it. So let's take a look at this list that was 3 wins, 1 draw at Warhammer Fest. I'm so sorry I don't have your name written down here. If this is you, write it in the comments because I think you did a great job. 2 Arcanaut Admiral, 2 Aether Cannons, 4 Arcanauts, and an Endrin Master with dirigible suit. That's, the biggest, heaviest flyer in KO. And the way this works is these Arcanaut Admirals have an ability called Fight for Profit that gives you +1 attack or +2 attacks if the Admiral is on an objective or holding a treasure. Now, in the Rumble pack, 5 out of the 6 missions are objective missions, and the other one is a treasure mission. So you are pretty much always going to be able to trigger this. And that's when your Aether Cannons, so the fun thing about Fight for Profit is it's one of the few abilities in the game that doesn't say melee attack actions, it just says attack actions. And so your Aether Cannons, which normally have 1 Strength 5 attack at 5 and 10, now get 2. So instead of rolling 2 dice, you get to roll 4 dice, which is pretty insane that you get to actually double their output. Normally, Aether Cannons just kind of live and die by their dice rolls, and getting to double their number of dice rolls is just really nice at reducing their variance and gives you the ability to just like table folks. It's really crazy. This is a really powerful way to run it. People have succeeded with lists like this, both in Europe and the United States. It's just all around really, really solid. I shouldn't speak as if Europe and the US are the only places that have run tournaments. We've actually seen a few tournaments in Chile. Shouts to the Chilean meta, and a couple tournaments in Malaysia as well. So shout out to them, and I'll try to stop speaking as if there's only 2 places where people play Warcry. Anyway, this list is really, really strong, and I think if you sort of put it together, I think you'll have a lot of success. Now, the other way to do KO is what I call daycare versions. And this is where you're going to bring in a fast assassin or dragon ally. I prefer the Thundercat, which is the Evocator Prime on Dracoline. But you can do other things too. So, for example, one person went with 2 Gore guys. So I call it Medusa Daycare. And they went 3-1 at Warhammer Fest. Did very, very well. And the reason you do it is the KO flyers are solid, but there are better ones in order. There are better fast hammer units in order. And so you build in one of those, and one of the great benefits to having one of the KO flyers is that you can put Fight for Profit anywhere you want. So you kind of compromise a little bit by reducing your commitment to the combo. You'll probably only have 1 leader. You'll probably, you might have 1 Aether Cannon, or you'll have 0. And you'll just have a lot more Arcanauts. Arcanauts are incredibly good. They're only 50 points. They can shoot. They can actually hold up in melee pretty well. They, still have 12 wounds for only 50 points. It's really amazing everything Arcanauts can do. And so this way, you're comboing less, but you are Arcanauting a whole bunch more, and you still have a fast assassin, or sometimes even 2, who are just like really chonky and take up most of the gravity on the board and allow your Arcanauts to then dominate with, just their points efficiency and their cheap activations. It works actually not dissimilarly to basically how Chimera Nurgle works, except it feels a lot more fair to play against. So here's the person who won Norcry, which is a Norwegian tournament. They went with an Arcanaut Admiral, 7 Arcanauts with pistol, 7 Arco with Skypike, a Thunderer with Aether Cannon, and an Evocator Prime with Grand Stave. I love to see this because it's just so cool to see someone like iterate and improve my Thundercat Daycare list and prove that it's really good. I believe this is Wombat's list if you go on the Discord. I do think that this list is better than mine was. Also, you have the sort of Medusa version that did well at Warhammer Fest. At this point, 3 different people trying it, all having a ton of success. I'm willing to say that this is definitely an established archetype version of Kharadron Overlords that you can definitely pilot to a lot of success. If going all in on these cannon combos doesn't necessarily appeal to you, you can absolutely win playing KO this way. KO, I think in the early days of 2.0 had a much lower win rate because you were seeing people experiment with a whole bunch of things. Like you were seeing people experiment with the balloons that have rifles on them. You were seeing people experiment with like having a lot of Thunderers with a lot of different loadouts, things like that. And I think now people are really starting to figure out and gravitate towards kind of the two paths that are really strong with KO. And I think both of those paths are capable of winning any tournament at any time. Cities of Sigmar has some really cool builds. Tempest Eye Dispossessed is really good because, one, they have that native speed buff, Swift as the Wind. Yes, it was nerfed in the FAQ. The fact that it used to be better is absurd. I've lost a decent number of games to Matt L. Locally here. We've had some really good matchups. And Matt's take constantly, because they hadn't built this list by the time the FAQ was created. They finished painting it after that. Matt's take constantly is, I can't believe this used to be better. This ability is incredible. So they've got that speed buff, and they've got highly efficient chaff, and multiple options of highly efficient chaff. So I like the Hammerers better, but people have also had a little bit of success with Ironbreakers, and I think Matt ran Longbeards. I think Longbeards are the 70.1. I'm sorry for that typo there. And then Hammerers, I think, are the 80.1. That's my mistake there. But I like the 70.1s the best because they are toughness 5, but they have a little bit more hitting power to them. But Ironbreakers are definitely also great. So I included a successful list from using both. Matt's is the Warden King, the Arcanaut Admiral, the Knight Arcanum. Knight Arcanums are a Stormcast wizard that have the best burn spell ability that you can get in order, and so that's really nice as a just way to reach out and touch the other sides of the battlefield. The tournament that we played included some hunter missions where you were going to have to kill things that were far away, and so the Knight Arcanum was a great way for Cities of Sigmar to do that, and also just having, again, a fighter who you could trust would be really difficult for your opponent to come kill. Then you have the Arcanaut Admiral, who's really solid because Fight for Profit, when you're using the 70-point chaff out of Cities of Sigmar, they have a 2-4 damage profile, and so Fight for Profit can actually be kind of spicy on them and give you some real killing power when you're giving them all +2 attacks. Now you have 5 attacks. Yes, you're strength 3, but 2-4 means that, and 5 attacks with only 70-point models means that your damage is adding up like for real. It is getting pretty serious. That is pretty intense output, which is great for objective missions where you can expect big team fights because you're running 10 fighters, right? You have pretty good numbers. So you can expect big team fights, and then you can dominate those team fights by just boosting your Hammerers just crazily. So this is a really cool list that has game in both sort of hunting missions and in team fight objective missions, and even kind of all bunch up in the center brawling missions as well. Then we have Dan H, but not me, going 3-1 at Warhammer Fest with a Warden King, an Achelian King with a polearm, and 9 Ironbreakers. Dan is basically saying, listen, I don't need the extra little bit of output from my chaff. I'll just be able to get paid by having an additional one for roughly the same number of points. Then I'll get all my offense from the Achelian King. And that's kind of nice because here you're running 11 fighters, which is just wild. There were people sort of going crazy and having 12, 13 fighters at Warhammer Fest, but 11 is usually going to be outnumbering your opponent. And then the Achillean King is just such an amazing sort of dragon piece to run around the board and just kill stuff. Really nice little setup. Again, this was for a Rumble Pack mission. The one above was for sort of a slightly more varied tournament, but this was for a Rumble Pack tournament. I think it's really well designed for that environment, and so well done, Dan, and congratulations on your great finish. Now I want to get into Horns of Hashut, which has kind of been a bit of a hidden juggernaut. It's very rarely played, but it has taken down or done really well in a couple tournaments now, and I think people should be prepared for it, because this isn't just theory crafting anymore. This is a couple people have put the theory into practice and done really well. Basically, you have really great chaff. You have probably the best chaff in the game that isn't movement 3. And then you have the best anti-chaff ability, which makes this perfect for objective missions, but you also have a surprising amount of game in hunter missions. So let's look. So the first is second place at Kansas City, a Ruinator Alpha with Heavy Flail, 4 Shatterers, 2 Demolishers with the Flamethrower, 1 Demolisher with Shield, and a Fomeroid Crusher. This list is amazing. It's only playing 1 weak fighter in the Demolisher with Shield. I guess the leader is not great, but it's not the most embarrassing. But having that Fomeroid Crusher in there is great for a tournament where you don't only have objective missions, because that FOMO Crusher can just absolutely go toe-to-toe with pretty much anything in a one-on-one fight. And then you have those Demolishers with Flame Hurlers to also be projecting power across the board. And so this is a really great setup if you want to kind of specialize a little bit more for objective missions. Thomas won in a tournament in Poland with a Ruinator Alpha 5 Shatterers, 3 Demolishers with Flame Hurler, and 1 Slaughter Priest with Hammer and Flail. This was a Rumble Pack tournament where Horns of Hashut is sort of the perfect execution of the idea. This isn't the only way to win in Rumble Pack, but it's one of the main ones, which is I'm just going to kill your cheapest fighters and that is it, and I will have my cheapest fighters survive. This list is very good at doing that. So Horns of Hashut is really good. I love this piece of art from Anna Deligiani, I believe is how you... I actually don't know how to pronounce the name. But they are a fan artist, which is why I'm crediting. Usually I don't credit because, for example, with pictures like this one, or they don't credit their artists. The only artist they have ever credited in the last few years, to my knowledge, is the person who did all their Fire Slayer art. Everyone else, they just don't credit their artists, which is too bad. Anyway, when I use fan art, I like to credit the artist, and this person does really great work, which is really cool. Like and subscribe for... No, that just seems self-serving. So Gloomspite Gitz. Really cool faction, really difficult to play. There's a lot of stumbling blocks here. The first is before the game, you need to be picking the right configuration for the mission pack, and that can be really tough. Knowing what missions you could potentially go up into, knowing when you need to have more numbers, maybe have fewer numbers, etc., which abilities to choose. It's all very difficult. And then in game, the name of the game with Gloomspite Gitz is just you have more abilities that do more things, and so choosing which ability to use is really tough. Choosing when to use them is really tough. And then I call this Wild Dice Discipline, but this is the skill in Warcry to understand which abilities you will need next round and to budget your wild dice this round in advance. And so normally wild dice, assigning wild dice is sort of thinking a step ahead about, what is the board right now and what do I want to affect the board right now. But people with great wild dice discipline don't just think about what is the board right now, but what might the board be like at the beginning of next round, and where do I want my wild dice to be or to look like after that. And so wild dice discipline, I would say, is a really difficult skill to get down, and it's not important for every faction, but it's extremely important for Gloomspite Gitz and very, very difficult. Probably the current master of Gloomspite Gitz right now is Peter M., who took second at Adepticon. This is the list. Bounder Boss, 2 Stabbas with Net, a Brew Git, Prog the Netta. We're already getting through so many abilities here. The first is the Bounder Boss using Madcap Destruction, which is a bonus move that also deals damage. So sort of 3/4 of a Rampage for a triple. The Stabbas with Net obviously have the netting double. Brugits, I did a whole video on Brugit combos and how good that ability is. Prog the Netta is one of the few Nettas that you would actually not be embarrassed to play even if it didn't have a net. It's the Underworld's Netter. Snurk Sourtongue, who is an incredibly difficult model to play because he dies so quickly, but he does a ton of damage, which makes him a really interesting sort of piece if you're able to kind of calculate with him and figure out the risk rewards. Then you have the Bolt Boy boss, who is a underwhelming artillery piece until you're using the ability, in which case it is a really incredible artillery piece. And then you have the Auric Mega Boss, which is an incredible one-on-one fighter, but often needs to be using its charge ability to move around. So Peter is playing a warband where every single fighter except for one needs to use their ability effectively to be good. And the one fighter that doesn't need to use the ability to be good needs to use positioning to be good. So every single fighter here is sort of a conditional MVP, but none of them can be MVPs all of the time, right? There's only so many doubles and triples that you can... It's a mostly double-hungry warband, but there's only so many doubles you can get per round. You're pretty much never going to have more than 3 doubles in a round. But that means that you can really only make 3 of your fighters good in any given round. And a lot of rounds, depending on how the dice tumble, you're only going to be able to make 2 fighters good. So you really have to think about that, and if you decide wrong on which fighter you're going to make be powerful in any given round, you will probably lose. But if you get it right, this is one of the highest ceiling things that you can be doing in Warcry. So there's a reason why Gloomspite Gitz actually have a pretty low win rate right now, and yet continue to place extremely highly in tournaments from time to time under the right pilots. If your meta includes good Gloomspite Gitz players who are really prepared and know their stuff, you do need to get ready to face them. Finally, we have Seraphon. I shouldn't say finally, there's a couple more things, but we have Seraphon here. They have a sort of a different sort of reason why they're good, but they have been winning a lot. A combination of excellent non-stats. So, for example, they have a decent reaction, but their offense all comes out of their triple ability, and so just losing one activation doesn't really mean that they can't deal a bunch of damage back, which means that they can kind of use their reaction with impunity, even on some of their more elite fighters, which is kind of cool, and I think is part of why they're good. They also have, if not the best Bladeborn team, it's definitely one of the best Bladeborn teams. Kixitaka has an incredible ability to give +1 move and +1 toughness. Otapodal has the kind of ranged damage output that they just don't give you anymore. Zepik is really nice as a cheap chaff fighter who's actually fast. Off Metamusing just won a tournament with the Bladeborn team plus Hunters of Huanchi. Andrew F. went undefeated at Warhammer Fest using Asaurus Knight Alpha, Asaurus Old Blood, and then just the entire Bladeborn team, which is really funny. So the entire Starblood Stalkers, even the ones that aren't that good. So the Bladeborn team is amazing, but they were doing decently well even before the Bladeborn team was allowed to be played. And I think it's really because of the reaction comboing with the offensive ability and the fact that some people were doing really well with just anytime you can get bonus actions on a double, and you can do that on Razordons or Salamanders by having skink handlers just force them to attack again. I think it's just like prodding them with their little poker sticks. The list below didn't have a skink handler combo, but they are out there and they do quite solid. I played against a Razordon combo opponent at Adepticon, and I was his only loss, and I was playing Nurgle Chimera. So does that even count as a loss if you lose to Nurgle Chimera? I don't know. So, my opponent just, had 1 draw and 2 wins for the rest of the tournament. So did really, really well, I think. Some honorable mentions. One is Iron Jaws, kind of a similar situation to, well, not a similar warband at all, but similar situation of just a consistently solid win rate. A lot of people play Iron Jaws, so we do see them kind of place highly in tournaments from time to time. It is very easy to misbuild Iron Jaws, so we see a lot of people have a lot of success with IJ, but you do see 0-4s and 1-3s with them too, because it is there's a lot of stuff that's tempting to do, like all brutes, for example, that can be really swingy. But they are the one elite stompy faction that can they can beat swarms on the Rumble Pack by using their U-Messin ability, but then they can also go toe-to-toe with any of the really fighty factions in the game. They can really get a lot of different things done depending on the missions, and the exact lists that do that are different, but Iron Jaws can be built for any situation, which is really nice. Ogre Maw tribes, they had a lot of early stumbles in 2.0. The win rate is going up quite a bit. I expect it to go up even more because they have the best one-on-one fighters in the game. They also have Noblars who can cover objectives, and those two things together makes for an incredibly powerful combination. That's all you really need to know, right? The Ogre leaders are able to win their fights against literally anything else they fight against that isn't an Ogre leader. Most of them can go one-on-one against a Chimera. Just a lot of power in Ogre Maw tribes. Stormcast Eternals are always going to appear in high numbers, but they're usually built in non-competitive ways. Ways that I see a lot of really, really well-painted Stormcast, which is very much not the stereotype about Stormcast players in AOS, I know. But in Warcry, it's like, oh, these 6 fighters, I'm just going to paint them incredibly well. I played against someone in Madison who I'm unfortunately blanking on his name, but he had just a mind-blowingly well-painted Stormcast Eternals force. It was really, really a pleasure to play against. So you see a lot of that, which means that people generally shy away from sort of the more competitive versions of Stormcast, and the more competitive versions are hard to play at a high level too. They're very punishing to mistakes because you don't have that many activations, so you have to make each one count. Now you do get abilities that boost your activations, but again, you have to have smart decisions about when you use those abilities. So for example, my Thick Boy Cardio list that I did a video about after I won a tournament with it, 2 other people have tried it. One person went second in a tournament. Congratulations to them. One person went 1 and 3, which doesn't say anything bad about them. It's just that it's really difficult to pilot. And the person who took second in a tournament, I know, had a lot of Stormcast Eternals experience before they used that list. And so, maybe they were a little bit more used to it. So it can be really difficult to play it well. And it's still tough in sort of a Rumble Pack if you know you're only going to play against objective missions. That can just be, I don't know how you beat a list on an objective mission that is tuned to only ever have to play against objective missions. When you play in a more balanced tournament pack and you get to play against lists, that are knowing they have to win some objective missions, but also knowing they have to win other missions too, you can beat them on objectives, but it can be hard to just chew through 15 fighters and score enough points. Just one other note, man, the monster nerf really, really hurt Stormcast because they really smashed monsters. They just were the absolute kryptonite for them. That Oops All Vindictors list that was really popular for a little while because it could really crush monsters. I've seen a couple people run it post FAQ and do pretty poorly. And the reason is because, they just don't have all those monsters running around for them to prey on. Stormcasts are absolutely the best monster hunters in the game and the biggest loser from the giant nerf to monsters. So I have written here grids are better than tier lists. Obviously that's not true. This is pretty hard for someone to read, but basically the top tier, the best factions are up here at the top. The worst factions are down here at the bottom. The factions that you're going to see the most are over here on the right, where it says everywhere. And you can, tough to see here, but you'll never see it. Bit of a meta pun there, is the least popular factions. And I wanted to do this to kind of show you what the meta actually looks like, because a tier list is not a meta. This is an actual metagame where, yes, there is this top right corner of really good factions that you will see a lot of, But there's also this bottom right corner of there's factions that are not very good that are just popular, right? Now, Nighthaunt I kind of put over here because they used to be quite popular. They're getting less popular. I'll probably drift them further to the left eventually, but in general, people do sometimes play them. You should probably be prepared to face anything on the right side of this line, but you should know that a lot of the stuff on the right side of that line is not the most powerful stuff in the game. If you want to be kind of unique and win some games, but maybe not necessarily be playing the same eye roll faction that everyone sees winning tournaments, doing something in this top corner here with either OBR, Horns of Hashut, Fire Slayers, or Hunters of Huanchi can be a great way to do that. Or if you want something that's, a little bit more proven, playing something kind of up in this area with Ogors, Cities of Sigmar, KO, SBG, Iron Jaws, Iron Golems, Rotmire Creed, Seraphon, something like that can be a really good idea, and would probably fit for a lot of people who, maybe are a little bit less confident with their list building skills, because you'll have sort of proven lists to go find on BCP, things like that. Overall, just kind of a snapshot I made of the meta based on, how many people are playing these factions and how much are these factions actually winning. So let's kind of look forward. What else might happen in Warcry or be coming in Warcry? So the meta, the big thing I think that I've noticed while sort of sifting through these tournament results is that the meta for a tournament is really the TO's decision, more than it is something based on sort of, some thing of this faction is better than that faction all the time. And the reason is because the Rumble Pack and the Core Book are both really exploitable, and for whatever reason, there's still more tournaments that are being run that are all one or all the other than there are that are kind of mixing them between each other. At Warhammer Fest, this was an all Rumble Pack tournament with 55 players, all 5 Soulblight Gravelords players together when it combined 16 and 4. It's very absurd. And again, I don't want to say that any of those players are unskilled. All I'm saying is that if all 5 are going 3-1 and better, then it's not the player's skill that's making that happen. Both of the KO players went a combined 6-1 and 1. Again, KO really, really exploits the Rumble Pack really well. So you can kind of see some factions are just designed for it so well. I do think that Rumble Pack missions, mission per mission, are just better designed missions in general than Core Book missions. But everything in the compendium, every faction in the compendium, all the points are calibrated to play in the types of missions that are in the Core Book. And so when you have all Core Book missions, you get a much more balanced meta. There's just, there's probably like 3 times as many factions that can compete at a high level in Core Book missions. And so even though maybe each mission individually is not necessarily as entertaining, you do have a much better meta. Now that said, there are still ways to kind of exploit that. People were finding, you wanted to be really elite in certain... Anytime ley lines wasn't being played, you wanted to be really elite in the Core Book and only have 6 or 7 fighters. The same is true for like all brawl tournaments, where things that maybe seemed like meme lists, by someone who maybe played Warcry 1.0 are just like laughably dominant and kind of stupid when you play a tournament where it's, everyone is only fighting all the time. I actually played a really fun tournament down in Madison where we did do all just center punch-up missions. 2 of the missions even counted how much damage you did in one activation, which is like incredibly unbalanced. And it was a really cool thought experiment in the form of a tournament, and I'm really thankful for the kind of opportunity to go. I took Skaven, all Storm Fiends. I went 3-1. I was really happy. I had a great time, but it did make me kind of think about the fact that, I don't think I would want to necessarily do it again, running it back the exact same way. I think it's sort of like a really sweet one-off, and I would hope if you were doing another one-off, it would either be like a different shtick or it would be sort of a more balanced group. And In general, I think the Warcry community needs TOs who either know the game or like to experiment, because I think it's really important to mix and match missions, whether you do a tournament that's all one type of mission and then another tournament later that's all a different type of mission, and you just like have skewed tournaments but you have different skews each time, or you balance it within a tournament and mix and match different types of missions and basically tell the players that the person who's warband can handle a bunch of different types of missions is going to win this tournament. Those types of things can create a much more balanced meta. The sort of faction win rates I've shown you, a lot of those are really influenced by the fact that Eastern Europe and the UK are running so many Rumble Pack missions that it is kind of dominating the stats, and it's really showing how exploitable the Rumble Pack really is. But I think it's a great idea to kind of, for different mission types, and you've got, objective missions, you've got hunter missions where like you just, like Bloodmarked is the classic one that's in all of the matched play scenarios, but not in the actual tournament core book pack. You have sort of brawl missions, which is, there's a bunch of these in the core book. There's one in the Rumble pack where you like all get up in the center and just have a big punch up. There's treasure missions. A lot of treasure missions are really broken, but there are a couple left in the game that are actually pretty fun and engaging. I think it's important to kind of mix and match these for your players so that they have a wider variety of experiences, and doing so you sort of create situations where different types of builds are required to succeed. I mean, there are factions that can build towards any mission type, and good for them for being able to do that, but it won't be the exact same list that succeeds every time, and so it will take a lot more player skill, and it will kind of create a much more interesting environment. Like I said before, there is a big fat middle in Warcry, which is good. You want to see that. But there is more factions at sort of odd, high win percentages than you'd like to see. And I think part of that is how big the haves and have-nots situation is on objective missions. That said, I do think the meta's in a really good place in that a lot of players keep experimenting. I just listed a ton of different factions with a ton of different things going on. People are experimenting with a ton of different builds, and one of the things I had said that I was kind of wishing we would see more in a meta video, this is 2 times ago now, this was my fall meta video, I was saying that I really wished we could see more kind of people doing kind of wild and weird stuff. And we are actually seeing that now, and that's really amazing to see, and I think it's gives me a lot of hope going forward. I also think that the 2 new teams that just came out in Nightmare Quest are really amazing. So you have the Stormcast team that is all allies, and they have a ability called Thundering Strides, which gives a free movement to a little friend within 6 inches of them. They're all around 165 points, and that's really cool because you can bring them into any order faction. I think that will definitely create a lot of different builds that are possible and kind of wild and weird. And then the Beast Flayers also have a really sort of cool build around movement ability called Sound the Hunt. Now that's going to be a little more complicated to build around because you have to bring things into Beast Flayers. Guy who has that ability is not an ally. But it's perfect for like Bladeborn teams that can come into Royal Beast Flayers. You can maybe import Chosen of the King combos from Flesh Eater Courts into Beast Flayers. You can do a lot of really cool stuff. And I am starting to have a lot of faith that people are going to be experimenting and people are going to be trying out a lot of the really fun stuff that hasn't been uncovered. This is more of a competitive metagame video, but there's a lot of stuff that's like just below the top tier of the competitive metagame that is sort of wild and crazy play styles that I think are really cool and can hold their own in certain situations in tournaments, and maybe take the odd 1 out of 3 games away from the top tier lists and give you a really sweet time. And I think people are starting to find those things and try them out. So I'll be looking forward to creating some content in the future that does sort of highlight those things. That is part of what I am doing with my lists for every faction video series. I've completed 2 of those for all of the first edition bespoke lists. You can check out all sorts of lists that I made there, exploring a lot of different things that the bespoke teams can do. I'll continue doing that for every Grand Alliance. I'm also going to be putting out the painting competition results soon. Comments are getting increasingly ornery about when we will see it. There was a lot to sift through. There was a lot of kind of deciding. We wanted to make sure that the people we were giving every prize to were really like what we were happy with, because there were just so many different incredible submissions, and it felt like a shame not to be acknowledging all the right ones. So that video is coming along, and until then, may all your rolls be crits.